Hello, this is Joe with Bon Jovi Acoustic Labs, and I'm going to be demonstrating crossover leakage control with the new Multiband AGC, or Dynamic Studio, built into DPS Generation 2 algorithms. So what is crossover leakage? Well, that happens when two adjacent bands in a multiband compressor are summing together, but the AGCs for each band are not compressing at the crossover. So let's take a look at that in a picture form. So for example, if our input level is here at the top of this picture, and we set our limiters for both bands down here at this red line, the limiter is going to limit the signal as long as it's hitting the threshold. Well, with a normal Linkwitz-Riley crossover, at the crossover point, we've got minus 6 dB for both bands. Now, with Linkwitz-Riley, they sum together and they create a flat frequency response, but from the perspective of the limiter, the signal has not hit the threshold. So, of course, when the signal is being limited by both bands and then it's summed together, we end up with this leakage. And it can be quite loud, at least 6 dB in some cases. So our goal is to create some kind of a flat frequency response where the signal is not leaking out through the crossover and causing distortion or some other unwanted effects in our products. So how are we handling that? To demonstrate it, I've got our multiband compressor set to 3-band mode. I'm going to turn off all of our crossover leakage controls here. Those are selected by these drop-down menus. Now I'm going to start by playing a test tone at 40 Hertz. Okay, I turn that on. Okay, so now we can see that our limiter, we see that we have the same limiter set for all 3 bands, is reducing gain and giving us an output at minus 7 dB. Okay, and if we set the test tone to 400 Hertz, we're still at minus 7 dB. Now our crossover is at 100 Hertz. If I set our test tone to 100, well, now the output's minus 2. That's quite a bit louder than minus 7 on either side of the crossover. So that's quite a bit of leakage that we have right at the crossover point. So let's turn on our crossover leakage control and do something about it. Now we have these different modes depending on the effect that you want. So I'm going to start with soft mode. And you can see that both bands are now sharing gain reduction for anything that happens at the crossover point. So while before we have on either side we have a minus 7 dB output level. So if I go back to 40, so we can see our output is around minus 7, and at 400, minus 7, but at 100 Hertz, it's minus 5. So we're allowing some leakage to occur because we don't necessarily want to compress with 2 wide bands like this all the way up to 1000 Hertz. We don't necessarily want to compress too much at that particular frequency. Now, in case you have more bands in your compressor and you do want to compress more, we have hard mode, which is H. So now you can see that both bands are actually sharing quite a bit of gain reduction. Our output is now minus 8 dB, and if I go to the left, 40 Hertz, output still minus 8. If I go to 400, minus 8. So it's generating a fairly flat frequency response. However, there's quite a bit of compression that's happening. And you can see that there's quite a wide range where both bands are compressing, and you may not want to have that depending on your application and the effect that you want for your speaker. So to mitigate that, where we don't want to be over compressing, we have these two options where you can favor one side of the crossover or the other. So if we want to favor the left side of the crossover, then we want the right side to be handling signals that are happening at the crossover point, and then vice versa. If we want to favor the right side, then we want the left side to handle signals that are happening at the crossover. So I can demonstrate that now. I'll start up our 40 Hertz test tone. I'll set it to left. And let's move that to the center of the crossover, 100 hertz. Okay, so since we're favoring the left side, the right side of the crossover is incurring more gain reduction. Now if I do it the opposite way, now the left side is favoring, the left side is taking more gain reduction and favoring the right-hand side. Now this is very useful in the case where you've got a small speaker and you want the low frequencies to be controlled all the way up through that crossover so you don't have distortion happening in your system. So if you set it to favor the right side band or your middle band, then all of the content up through the crossover will be handled by the low frequency AGC. That's super important for preventing distortion and all that from low frequency signals. So let me demonstrate that once again. We got our test tone at 100 hertz. This we're favoring the right band, so we have left band compressing. You can see it's at -4. And then favoring the left side, now the compression's on this side, still -4 dB. And we can see that if we go back down to 40, we're at that -7 point. So we're allowing 3 dB of leakage. However, that's a musical amount, right? It's not too much where you're going to cause distortion if you calibrate things correctly, but you are controlling quite a bit of the signal as it passes through that crossover area. Now the last mode that we have is responsive mode. Let me stop our test tone. This one is generating a flat frequency response as well. It's probably the most flat. It's also fairly aggressive, but if you want to have that, if you have a lot of bands, you want them all to be very flat, where you're trying to make a very loud speaker, this responsive mode is good for that. Maybe you wouldn't want to use it in a 3-band arrangement, but definitely in a 5-band arrangement, it's very effective if you want to have a brick wall limiter across the entire spectrum. So I'll turn it on for 40 hertz. We've got our -8 dB, put it at 100, -7, and then 400, -7. So I'll slide this down so you can see how little it actually changes. We're at -8, -8, -7 as it's sharing, staying at -7, -8. So you can see that it allows very little leakage. It's very, very tiny amount, even as you have very small amounts of change in the actual content that's coming in. So that's how crossover leakage is handled in the new Bon Jovi multiband compressor. If you have any questions about it, please let us know. We definitely encourage people to experiment with these different bands and how they affect different parts of music and movies and all of that. We'd love to hear your comments on how you apply this to your situation. So until next time, this is Joe with Bon Jovi Acoustic Labs.